The day we buried our father, our uncle sat us down at the kitchen table, the same table where Dad used to help us with homework, and told us we owned nothing. He slid a single piece of paper across the wood and smiled the way men smile when they've already won. We were 21 and 20 years old, and we said nothing. We just looked at each other across that table. And that look was the beginning of everything. My name is Max Calloway. I'm 21. My sister Dana is 20. And what I'm about to tell you is the story of how two kids who grew up watching their father build something from nothing learned, at the worst possible moment, exactly what he had quietly built for them. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere that was made for you, stay with me. This one is for you. Our father's name was Joseph Calloway. He came to this country at 26 with a construction trade certificate, $40 in his wallet, and a work ethic that embarrassed everyone around him. He didn't talk about where he came from very often. What he talked about was concrete, load-bearing walls. The difference between a foundation that holds and one that only looks like it does. He'd tap a wall with his knuckle at a job site and know, just from the sound, whether the men behind him had done it right. By the time Dana and I were old enough to understand what he did, Calloway Construction had 12 employees, 2 trucks, and a reputation in our county for being the firm you called when you needed something built to actually last. It wasn't glamorous. Dad wore the same steel-toed boots for 6 years until the soles separated, and he duct-taped it back on for another season. Our house was modest. Our vacations were camping trips 2 hours from home. But every Friday night, Dad would sit at the kitchen table with his ledger, an actual paper ledger, not a spreadsheet. And he would go through the numbers with the focused satisfaction of a man who knows that every figure on the page is real because he personally carried it there. I started sitting with him when I was 12. Not because he asked me to, because I wanted to. There was something about watching him work through those columns, expenses, receivables, labor costs, material overruns, that felt more honest than anything I learned in school. He'd explain things without dumbing them down. This client paid late again. See how that ripples? It delays the payment to the supplier. The supplier charges a late fee. The late fee eats into the margin on the Hendricks job. Everything connects, Max. Every number has a consequence. I started doing the preliminary sorting for him when I was 14. By 16, I was building his monthly summaries in a spreadsheet I designed myself, cross-referencing his paper ledger against the bank statements. He'd check my work carefully at first, then less carefully. Then one evening he just pushed the bank statement across to me and went to make coffee without a word, which was, for Joseph Calloway, the highest possible form of professional praise. Dana came at the business from a different angle. She was the one who read. Always. Books from the library piled on her nightstand, 2 and 3 deep. But from the time she was 15, a specific kind of book started appearing in that pile. Contract law, business law, a thick-used textbook on civil procedure she'd found at a garage sale for $1 and annotated in 3 different colored pens. Dad noticed. He never made a big thing of it. He wasn't a man who made big things of moments. But one evening I heard him tell her quietly that if she kept reading like that, she'd understand more law by 20 than most people learn in a lifetime. She was 20 when he died. She'd completed 2 years of her legal studies program. She understood contracts the way I understood balance sheets. Not perfectly, not professionally, but well enough. Well enough for what was coming. Our mother, Elena, had come into Dad's life 8 years before he launched the business. She was working as a housekeeper for a property management firm that maintained several rental units, including the apartment where Dad lived when he first arrived. That's how they met. She was 23. He was 28. She brought him soup once when he was sick with a flu so bad he couldn't stand, and he told us years later that he decided in that moment he intended to marry her. She laughed every time he told that story. He told it often. She died when Dana was 11 and I was 12. A car accident on a Tuesday morning. Ordinary Tuesday. The kind of day nothing is supposed to happen on. After that, it was the 3 of us. Dad, Dana, and me. And the business, which became, in a way, the 4th member of the family. The thing that held us together when grief tried to pull us apart. Dad threw himself into the work the way people throw themselves into anything when the alternative is sitting still with loss. We threw ourselves in with him. Uncle Richard appeared the year I turned 13. Dad's younger brother. 11 years between them. Richard had lived most of his adult life in another state, in another world, sales jobs, apartment rentals, a lifestyle built on looking successful rather than being it. When he showed up, he was 41, recently divorced, and carrying himself with the easy confidence of a man who'd never had to build anything because he was always planning to attach himself to something someone else had built. He was charming, genuinely charming, the kind that works on people who want to believe the best of those they love. He made Dad laugh in a way we rarely saw. He brought energy into the house. He told stories at the dinner table that made even Dana, who was slow to warm to anyone new, lean in and smile. Within 6 months, he was working for the business. Dad gave him the client relations role, meeting with new prospects, maintaining relationships with existing accounts, representing Callaway Construction at the community chamber events where Dad never felt comfortable in a blazer. Richard was good at it, genuinely good. Clients liked him. He had the handshake and the eye contact and the memory for small personal details that makes people feel important. I noticed things, even then. Small things. The way he'd sometimes steer Dad away from certain conversations about finances. The way he'd arrived at the business already knowing the names of clients Dad hadn't mentioned to him yet. The way certain expense receipts he submitted were vague in ways that Dad, who was precise about everything, didn't scrutinize the way he scrutinized everything else. Because it was Richard. Because you don't audit your brother. I didn't say anything. I was 13, then 15, then 17. Each time I noticed something and stayed quiet, the silence became slightly easier to maintain and slightly harder to break. I told myself I was probably wrong. I told myself Dad was smarter than me about people. I told myself family was complicated and I should stay in my lane. Dana noticed things too. We talked about it once, late at night in the kitchen, in the careful way teenagers talk about things they're not sure they're allowed to say. Something's off with him, she said. She didn't need to specify who. I know, I said. Dad won't see it. I know. We sat with that for a while. We watch, she said finally. We learn everything we can about how the business works. And we wait. I was 17 when she said that. She was 16. Neither of us knew then what we were actually waiting for, or how completely the thing we were waiting for would eventually arrive. Dad got sick in the winter of the year I turned 20. It came fast. That's the thing about certain illnesses. They don't build slowly. They arrive. A diagnosis in January. Hospitalization in March. By April, he was in a bed he would not get out of again, and the business was running on momentum and Richard's management, and Dana and I were spending every hour we could at the hospital beside a man who was becoming, week by week, a smaller version of himself. He talked to us in those weeks. Really talked. The way people do when time has become precise and there's no longer any margin for leaving things unsaid. He talked about our mother, about the early years of the business, about what he wanted for us. He held our hands, my hand, Dana's hand, and he looked at us with the specific expression of a man who has built something real and is trying to make sure the people he loves understand its full weight. He didn't talk about Richard. We didn't push. He was tired. Every conversation cost him something. We chose what we asked him carefully. He died on a Thursday in May. Quiet. Dana and I were both there. The room was very still. And 4 days later, at the kitchen table where he'd taught me to read a balance sheet, our uncle slid a single piece of paper across the wood and told us that our father had left the business to him. We were 21 and 20 years old. We looked at each other across the table, and neither of us said a word. Subscribe if you've ever been told to know your place and refused. This story is just getting started. The paper Richard slid across the table was a single page. Typed, not handwritten. A logo at the top from a law firm neither of us had ever heard of. Mercer and Holt, an address in a city 40 minutes away. The language was formal and clean, the kind of clean that takes effort to manufacture. Last will and testament of Joseph Aaron Callaway, dated April 19th, 3 weeks before he died, when he was already in the hospital, when the morphine drip was already doing its quiet, relentless work on the man who used to tap walls with his knuckle and know, just from the sound, whether they would hold. Richard didn't say much. He didn't need to. The document was doing the talking for him. He sat across from us with his hands folded on the table and his expression arranged into something that was trying very hard to look like grief and landing closer to patience. The patience of a man who has been waiting for a particular meeting to conclude so he can get on with the business of the day. The will left the entirety of Callaway Construction, its contracts, its equipment, its accounts, its name, the trucks with our father's initials stenciled on the door panels, to Richard James Callaway. There was a small note about personal belongings being divided between the children. The word children used exactly like that. Clinical. Categorical. As if Dana and I were a line item. We were given 1 week to remove our personal effects from the office. I was 21 years old, and I had been reading that company's numbers since I was 14. I knew the balance in every account. I knew which clients paid on time, and which ones needed 2 calls. I knew the cost per square foot on every active job and the name of every subcontractor and the expiration date of every insurance policy. I had spent 9 years learning that business the way other people learn a language, by living inside it, by making small mistakes and correcting them, by slowly becoming fluent in something that took a lifetime to build. And a single typed page was telling me I had 1 week to collect my things. Dana sat very still beside me. I knew her stillness. It was not the stillness of shock. It was the stillness of a person who is thinking faster than they are breathing, who has gone quiet not because they have nothing to say, but because they understand, instinctively, completely, that this is not the moment for words. That words right now would cost more than silence. We left the house without signing anything. Richard called after us that there were some additional documents that would need our signatures. Dana didn't turn around. I didn't either. We walked to my car, got in, and sat for a moment in the driveway of the house our father had paid off 12 years ago, looking at the front door through the windshield. Then we drove away. The week that followed was the first real test of something Dana and I had never consciously developed, but had apparently been building without knowing it: the ability to grieve and think at the same time. To feel the full weight of losing our father while simultaneously refusing to let that grief be used against us. Because that was what Richard was counting on. He knew we were devastated. He had timed the conversation deliberately, for days after the funeral, while the loss was still raw and enormous and consuming, while the part of our minds that might have pushed back was still occupied with the impossible task of adjusting to a world that no longer contained our father. It was a calculated move. We understood that even in the fog of those first days, the timing wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. Dana drove back to her apartment and spread everything she had ever learned about estate law across her kitchen table. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since the funeral. She wasn't sleeping now. She was reading, annotating, building a framework in her mind for what would need to be proven and how. She texted me at 2 in the morning with questions that told me exactly how her mind was working, not panic questions, precise ones. Questions about dates and witnesses and the specific legal requirements for a valid will in our state. I drove to the office, not during business hours, not when Richard or any of his newly repositioned staff would be there. I went at 6 in the morning, for days after the conversation at the kitchen table, before the sun had fully come up, with the key I still had and hadn't been asked to return. I went to the back room where Dad kept the paper ledgers, the real ones, the originals, going back to the founding year of the company. Richard had moved things, rearranged the filing system in the 3 weeks since Dad had been hospitalized, enough to make it look like the office already belonged to him. But the ledgers were still there, in the cabinet where they'd always been, because Richard didn't understand what they were. He was a client relations man. He thought in conversations and handshakes. He didn't think in columns. I photographed every page of every ledger going back 7 years. It took 4 hours. My phone storage filled twice, and I transferred to a backup drive I'd brought with me. My hands were steady the entire time. I was surprised by that. I'd expected them to shake. But there was something about being in that room, surrounded by the physical record of everything my father had built, that quieted something in me. This was real. This was documented. This existed in ink and paper in a way that no single typed page from a firm called Mercer and Holt could simply erase. I took the photographs and I drove home, and I didn't tell anyone what I'd found yet. Because I hadn't found it yet. I just had the raw material. The pattern would take weeks to emerge, weeks of late nights and spreadsheets and the slow, methodical work of tracing money from where it entered the business to where it was supposed to go to where it actually went. The discrepancies I'd noticed over the years, the vague receipts, the expense reports that never quite added up, I'd filed them away in the back of my mind as things that didn't make sense, things I'd been too young and too uncertain to confront. I was not too young anymore. And the numbers, once I started laying them out in full, were not small. Part 3. The number that finally stopped me was $412,000. Not because it was the largest single figure in the spreadsheet. It wasn't. It had accumulated the way quiet things accumulate, in increments small enough to explain away individually, large enough to constitute something criminal in aggregate. A materials invoice here, padded by 12%. A subcontractor payment there, routed through a company name I didn't recognize. Equipment rental fees charged to active jobs that, when I cross-referenced against the site logs Dad kept in his ledgers, had never actually been used on those jobs. The money had moved in amounts that never quite triggered the thresholds that might have drawn attention. Never too large, never too obvious, always dressed in the language of legitimate business expense. 7 years. Richard had been doing this for 7 years. He had started within 8 months of joining the company. I could see it in the records, a clean period at the beginning, the first several months where everything balanced correctly and the expense reports were precise and the subcontractor payments matched the work orders. A trial period, I realized. He had spent his first months learning the system before he began taking from it. Learning how Dad managed the books, where he looked closely and where he trusted without verifying, which accounts were monitored and which ones moved too much volume to scrutinize line by line. Then, methodically, he had begun. I built the full picture across 3 weeks of nights, sleeping 4 hours and spending the rest of the time at my kitchen table with the photographs of the ledgers and a spreadsheet that grew longer and more precise with every session. I cross-referenced the company expense records against public business registry databases and found 3 of the subcontractor companies Richard had been paying, companies that appeared on invoices that received wire transfers from Callaway construction accounts, were registered to a holding entity that traced back, through 2 layers of intermediary LLCs, to a residential address. An address I recognized. Richard's ex-wife's sister. A name just distant enough to create plausible deniability, just close enough to confirm intent. He had built himself a quiet machine, running parallel to the real business, invisible inside it, draining it with the patience of someone who understood that small and consistent beats large and risky every time. Dana came to my apartment on a Saturday morning, and I showed her everything. She sat at the table and read through the summary document I'd prepared, not the raw data, which would have taken days, but the structured analysis, organized chronologically, with the shell companies identified and the payment patterns mapped and the total calculated at the bottom of the last page. She read it the way she read everything, completely still, moving only to scroll or turn a page, her face giving nothing away. When she finished, she sat back and was quiet for a long moment. Then she opened her bag and placed an envelope on the table in front of me. It was a standard white envelope, slightly worn at the corners, sealed. Our father's handwriting on the front. 2 words, in the careful block letters he used when something mattered. Dana's name. She told me he had given it to her 6 months before he died. Before the diagnosis. Before any of us knew what was coming. He had handed it to her on an ordinary Sunday afternoon when I happened to be out, and he had told her to keep it somewhere safe and open it when the time came. He hadn't explained what he meant by that. He was a man who trusted the right moment to make itself known. She had kept it for 6 months without opening it. Through the diagnosis, through the hospitalization, through the funeral, through Richard's performance at the kitchen table. She had carried it without opening it because she trusted her father's judgment about timing more than she trusted her own grief to know when the moment was right. She told me she thought the moment was now. I looked at the envelope on the table between us, at his handwriting on the front, at the worn corners that meant she had taken it out and held it more than once without opening it, had sat with the weight of it, had resisted, had waited. We didn't open it that morning. Dana picked it up and put it back in her bag. Not yet, she said. We needed one more thing first. We needed to know exactly what we were walking into before we revealed what we were holding. An envelope opened at the wrong moment, in front of the wrong people, without the right preparation surrounding it, was just paper. We needed it to land inside a structure that would make it impossible to challenge, impossible to dismiss, impossible to survive. She had already contacted someone. A forensic document examiner, a professional who assessed the authenticity of legal documents, including signatures, dating, paper composition, ink aging. She had found him through one of her law professors, presented the situation in general terms, and secured an appointment for the following week. She wanted the so-called will from Mercer and Holt examined before we showed anyone what we actually had. Because Dana, at 20 years old, had already understood the thing that takes most people a lifetime to learn, that the order in which you reveal information is as important as the information itself. You don't show your answer before you've fully understood the question. You don't open your hand until you know exactly what the other person is holding in theirs. We sat in my kitchen for another hour that morning, not talking much, the spreadsheet still open on my laptop, the envelope back in her bag, the number $412,000 sitting in the air between us like a held breath. Outside, it was an ordinary Saturday. Somewhere across the city, Richard Callaway was driving one of the company trucks, our father's trucks, with his initials still on the door. We let him drive it a little longer. The forensic examiner's name was Gerald Pruitt. His office was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and printer toner, the kind of place that exists specifically to be unimpressive, where serious work happens without any interest in announcing itself. He was 63, semi-retired, had spent 20 years as a document analyst for the state attorney's office before going private. Dana had chosen him carefully. She didn't want someone eager. She wanted someone whose opinion had already survived courtrooms. We brought him a certified copy of the will Richard had produced. We didn't tell him what we suspected. We told him only that we had questions about its authenticity and needed a professional assessment. He asked us to leave it with him for 10 days. We waited. Those 10 days were the hardest of the entire process, not because we doubted what we would find, but because waiting with knowledge is its own particular cruelty. We knew what Richard had done. We knew what we were holding. We knew the shape of what was coming. And still we had to move through ordinary days, answering Richard's occasional emails about estate paperwork with neutral, non-committal responses, watching him settle further into the business our father had built, watching him move through the world as a man who believed he had already won. He was consolidating quickly. That became clear in those 10 days. He had already approached 2 of Dad's longest-standing clients directly, repositioning himself not as a continuation of Callaway Construction, but as its new era. He had ordered new signage for the trucks, not a complete rebrand. He was smart enough to know the name still carried value, but subtle changes that began the process of making the company his in every visible way. The initials on the door panels were finally changed. Small white letters painted over. The last physical trace of our father's direct ownership gone. Dana saw a photo of the new lettering posted to the company's social media account, which Richard had also taken over. She sent it to me without comment. I looked at it for a long time. Then I put my phone face down on the table and went back to the spreadsheet. On the 9th day, Pruitt called. He spoke for 11 minutes. Dana had him on speaker, and I sat beside her at her kitchen table taking notes, though I barely needed to. Every word landed with the kind of clarity that doesn't require notes because it burns directly into memory. The signature attributed to Joseph Aaron Callaway on the document dated April 19th showed significant inconsistencies with authenticated reference signatures from the same period. The pressure pattern was wrong. The letter formation in the surname deviated from established habit in ways that don't occur in genuine signatures even under physical distress. The ink dating, while not conclusive on its own, was inconsistent with the document's claimed date. His professional opinion, stated plainly and without drama, was that the signature was not produced by the named signatory. He would put it in writing. He would testify to it if required. Dana thanked him, ended the call, and sat quietly for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Then she reached into her bag and took out the envelope. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She just opened it the way you open something you've been carrying a long time, carefully, without tearing, preserving it. Inside was a single folded document. Several pages, professionally prepared, bearing the seal of a notary public and the letterhead of an attorney named Patricia Voss, whose office was in a town 40 minutes in the opposite direction from Mercer and Holt. Last will and testament of Joseph Aaron Callaway, dated 14 months before his death, signed before 2 witnesses and a notary on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when our father was healthy and clear-headed and entirely himself. Callaway Construction and all associated assets were left in equal shares to Maxwell Joseph Callaway and Dana Marie Callaway. There was a handwritten line at the bottom, below the formal legal language, in our father's block letters. Not part of the official document. Added separately, in the margin, in ink that had dried into the paper the color of something permanent. It said, "I always knew they were watching. Build it right." Dana folded the document closed. Neither of us spoke for a while. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, traffic moved past the window the way traffic always moves, indifferent, continuous, unbothered by the things that change everything inside ordinary rooms. We had what we needed. Now came the part that required the most discipline of all, sitting with a winning hand and not playing it. Not yet, because Richard was about to make one more move, and we needed him fully extended before we responded. We had heard through one of Dad's old partners that Richard was finalizing a significant refinancing arrangement, using the company assets as collateral for a large business loan. A loan that would give him liquidity, consolidate his position, and make the business genuinely difficult to unwind even with legal intervention. He had scheduled the signing for the following month. We let him schedule it. Richard held the celebration at the company's main job site. Not a formal event. He was too careful for anything that looked like gloating. Just a Friday afternoon gathering, food brought in, the crew assembled, a casual announcement dressed in the language of gratitude and continuity. He spoke about honoring Joseph Callaway's legacy. about the responsibility of carrying a name forward, about the exciting new direction the company would take under fresh leadership. Several of the older employees, men who had worked alongside our father for over a decade, stood with their paper plates and said nothing, their faces doing the quiet work of people who know something is wrong but cannot yet name it precisely enough to act. Dana heard about it from one of them, a site foreman named Ernie who had known our father since the beginning, who had been at our mother's funeral, who had taught me how to read a construction blueprint when I was 15 and thought I already knew everything. He called her the evening after the gathering, his voice carrying the particular discomfort of a man reporting something he wishes he hadn't witnessed. We didn't respond publicly. We sent Ernie a brief, warm message thanking him for telling us and asking him to continue as normal. Nothing more. He was not our soldier. He was just a decent man who thought we should know. Meanwhile, Richard had begun spending. The loan he was arranging was structured around the company's asset base, the equipment, the active contracts, the receivables, the property Dad had purchased 12 years ago to use as the company yard. Combined, it represented collateral for a facility of just over $800,000. He had already engaged an interior designer for the office renovation. He had actually flown, to meet a potential client in another state, charging the flights and hotel to the company account. He had hired 2 new administrative staff without posting the positions or interviewing externally, both of them people connected to his personal network, both of them now embedded inside the operational structure of the business. He was moving fast because fast was the right instinct when you've taken something that isn't yours. Speed creates facts. Facts create legitimacy. Legitimacy is very hard to unwind once it has been given enough time to calcify into normalcy. He understood that. We understood that he understood it, which is why the timing of what came next had to be exact. The loan signing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. A conference room at the bank. Richard, the bank's commercial lending officer, and a representative from the title company that would be processing the lien against the company property. Standard procedure for a transaction of that size. Signatures required. Everything formalized. Everything made real and recorded and legally binding. We knew the date. We knew the location. We knew the time. 3 days before that Thursday, Dana filed a formal legal challenge to the probate of Richard's will, the forged document from Mercer and Holt, supported by Pruitt's written forensic assessment, authenticated copies of the genuine notarized will prepared by Patricia Voss, and a sworn statement from Voss herself confirming the document's preparation and execution 14 months prior. She filed simultaneously in probate court and sent formal written notice to the bank's legal department, citing the active dispute over ownership of the assets Richard intended to use as collateral. Banks do not process liens against assets whose ownership is under active legal dispute. That is not a matter of policy preference. It is a matter of fundamental institutional risk management. The moment the bank's legal team received Dana's notice, the Thursday signing stopped being a formality and became a problem requiring immediate internal review. The lending officer called Richard that same afternoon. We knew this because Patricia Voss, who had become something of a quiet ally in the weeks since we contacted her, had a professional relationship with the bank's outside counsel and was able to confirm, without revealing anything confidential, that the call had been made and that Richard's response had been loud enough to be heard through a closed office door. He was not calm about it. That was important. Calm men in difficult situations are manageable. Men who lose composure when their plans are disrupted reveal, in that disruption, exactly how much of their position depends on nothing being examined too closely. Richard's anger told the bank's legal team something useful, not about us, but about him. About the gap between the confidence of his presentation and the fragility of what lay beneath it. We were not in any of those rooms. We were not on any of those phone calls. We were sitting in Dana's apartment, the genuine will on the table between us, Pruitt's report beside it, the 31-page financial analysis beside that, waiting with the particular stillness of 2 people who have done everything they can do and now must simply allow the machinery they have set in motion to run. Thursday was 3 days away. Richard didn't know we would be in that conference room. He didn't know we had been invited. The bank's conference room was on the 14th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a long oval table, the kind of room designed to make transactions feel significant. We arrived 8 minutes early. Dana carried a structured document case, the kind lawyers carry, dark navy, unassuming. Inside it was everything. The genuine will, Pruitt's forensic report, the 31-page financial analysis, Patricia Voss's sworn statement, 8 months of our father's stolen money organized into clean, numbered exhibits. We sat down and we waited. Richard walked in 4 minutes later. He saw us before he saw anyone else in the room. That was the moment, the precise, unrepeatable moment when everything he believed about his own position met the reality of ours. His face did something that happened too fast to fully describe. A kind of internal collapse, contained almost immediately behind the practiced composure of a man who had spent his entire adult life performing confidence he didn't fully possess. He recovered within 2 seconds. But those 2 seconds told us everything we needed to know about how certain he had been that we would never make it into this room. He said our names. Flat, controlled, a question disguised as a greeting. Dana smiled at him the way our father used to smile at a wall he was about to test. Patient, already knowing what the sound would tell him. The bank's commercial lending officer entered with his assistant and a representative from their legal team, which had been expanded that morning from the standard 1 attorney to 3. That expansion was, itself, a message. Banks don't bring 3 lawyers to a routine signing. They bring 3 lawyers when they have received information suggesting that routine is not what the situation actually is. Richard understood what the 3 lawyers meant. We watched him understand it. The lending officer opened the meeting professionally, thanking everyone for their time, before immediately deferring to his legal team to address what he called a procedural matter requiring clarification before any documents could be executed. The lead attorney, a precise woman in her 50s named Carol Huang, placed a copy of Dana's legal filing on the table. She explained, in measured and completely neutral language, that the bank had received formal notice of an active probate dispute regarding the ownership of the assets proposed as collateral. She explained that the bank's policy, consistent with standard institutional practice, prohibited the processing of liens against assets under contested ownership. She explained that the signing could not proceed until the ownership question was resolved through the court. Richard's attorney, a man we had never seen before, clearly engaged recently and clearly not fully briefed on the depth of what he was walking into, began to speak. He got approximately 40 seconds into his argument before Carol Huang placed a second document on the table, Pruitt's forensic report. She gave Richard's attorney a moment to read the summary page. The argument stopped. Dana opened her document case. She did it without drama, without announcement. The way our father used to open his ledger at the kitchen table, as if the act of opening it was simply the next logical step in an ongoing process that had always been moving toward this moment. She removed the documents one at a time and placed them in a neat row across the conference table. The genuine will first. Patricia Voss's notarization seal visible from across the table. Pruitt's full report second. 42 pages of forensic analysis with his professional credentials attached. The sworn statement from Voss third. Dated, witnessed, unambiguous. The financial analysis last. 31 pages. Tabbed. Color-coded by year. The shell companies identified. The payment patterns mapped. The total, $412,000. At the bottom of the final page in the same plain font as every other number in the document, because it didn't need emphasis. The number emphasized itself. Richard looked at the row of documents on the table. He had the look of a man who has been building something in the dark for years and has just had the lights turned on, not surprised that the structure exists, because he built it himself and knows every corner of it, but suddenly, sickeningly aware of how it appears to other people in full illumination. Every careful, patient, incremental thing he had done across 7 years, laid out in sequence under fluorescent conference room lighting, in front of bank attorneys who were paid to understand exactly what they were looking at. Carol Huang asked Richard's attorney if he wished to respond to the forensic findings regarding the April 19th document. The attorney asked for a recess to consult with his client. They stepped into the hallway. Through the glass partition, we could see Richard speaking. His attorney was not speaking much, mostly listening, with the expression of a man rapidly recalculating what this engagement was going to cost him and whether the client across from him had been fully honest about the facts of the case. They were in the hallway for 11 minutes. When they came back, Richard's attorney requested an adjournment. No counterargument. No challenge to Pruitt's findings. No alternative explanation for the $412,000. Just a request for time, which was itself the only answer that mattered. Dana said she had no objection to an adjournment. She said it pleasantly, completely calm. 20 years old, sitting in a 14th-floor conference room, having just placed 7 months of patient, sleepless, grief-soaked work on a table in front of the man who had tried to take everything her father built, and she said it pleasantly, the way our father used to say things that were already decided. Richard didn't look at us when he left. He walked past the row of documents without looking at them either, as if not looking could retroactively unmake the fact that they existed, that they were real, that they were already in the hands of people whose job was to act on exactly this kind of information. The door closed behind him. Dana gathered the documents back into her case. Unhurried, each one returned to its place in the order she had established. When she was done, she closed the case and set it on her lap and looked out the window at the city below, where everything was continuing as it always continues. Indifferent, ordinary, unbothered. I looked at her profile against the window. At my sister, 20 years old, who had carried a sealed envelope for 6 months without opening it because she trusted our father's sense of timing more than her own grief. She turned and caught me looking. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We didn't need to. Part 7. The criminal fraud referral was filed by the bank's legal team 14 days after the conference room. Not by us. We had placed the documents on the table. The institution acted on its own obligations. We hadn't asked them to. We hadn't needed to. The probate court ruled 31 days after Dana's filing. Patricia Voss testified in person. Gerald Pruitt answered questions from the bench for 40 minutes with the calm precision of a man who had done this in courtrooms for 2 decades. Richard cycled through 3 attorneys in those 31 days, each engagement ending faster than the last as the full dimensions of the situation became clear to whoever he had just hired. The attorney representing Mercer and Holt withdrew on the morning of the hearing without explanation, which was itself an explanation. The judge voided the April 19th document entirely. The genuine will was admitted to probate without challenge. Callaway Construction passed equally to Maxwell Joseph Callaway and Dana Marie Callaway. We were in the second row when the ruling was read. I had brought our father's original paper ledger without fully deciding why. It felt right to have it in the room. Dana had her hands folded in her lap and her document case at her feet, and when the judge finished reading, she didn't react visibly, because she had never needed the ruling to confirm what she already knew was true. Richard walked out without looking at us. In the moment he passed, something crossed his face that I have thought about many times since. Not anger. Something quieter. The expression of a man who has finally understood that the thing he spent years taking was never actually his, and that the people he underestimated had known that the entire time. Outside on the courthouse steps, Dana and I stood in the thin morning light without speaking. Then she said, "Let's go to work." We did. Ernie was in the parking lot when we arrived at the office. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once, the way our father used to nod at a wall that had come back clean, and went back to work. The initials on the truck door panels were repainted that Saturday morning, without being asked, without charging for his time. We were 21 and 20 years old. We went to work. The state attorney's investigation took 4 months. We handed over everything. The full financial analysis, the photograph ledgers, the shell company research, and then we stepped back and returned to the work of running a company that had nearly been dismantled from the inside, while we were still learning to exist in a world without our father in it. Those 4 months were not triumphant. That's the part revenge stories never tell you. The part after the conference room, after the courthouse steps. The part where you go back to the office every morning and the grief is still there, unchanged, patient, waiting for you in the quiet between tasks. Winning didn't return our father. The genuine will didn't give us back the months we had spent watching him disappear in a hospital bed. The charges filed against Richard included forgery, fraudulent misrepresentation, and systematic financial misappropriation. He cycled through 4 attorneys before one finally stayed. The case resolved 8 months after the initial charges. Dana received the call on a Tuesday afternoon while reviewing a contract at her desk. She came to my doorway and told me the outcome in 2 sentences. Guilty on all primary counts. Sentencing in 6 weeks. I nodded. She went back to her desk. We finished the workday. That evening we drove to the cemetery together. We stood at our father's grave for a long time without speaking. What I felt standing there was not satisfaction. It was something more complete than satisfaction. The feeling of having done something correctly. Not perfectly, not without cost, but correctly, in the way our father had taught us to understand correctness. Not as the absence of mistakes, but as the presence of integrity throughout the entire process. We had not acted from anger when anger would have been the easiest response. We had done the work. We had waited. We had let the truth speak in a room full of people whose job was to listen to it. I always knew they were watching. Build it right. Ernie repainted the initials on the truck door panels that Saturday without being asked and without charging for his time. The crew came back. The company in its first full year posted its strongest revenue in its history. Not because we were smarter than our father, but because he had built something with enough structural integrity to survive what had been done to it. Good foundations do that. The extended family reached out in ones and twos after the verdict. Careful messages, hedged, framed as concern rather than apology. We responded briefly and without cruelty. We didn't need their acknowledgement. The account had been settled in a courtroom, in a bank conference room, in a probate filing that was now part of the public record. Dana passed her second-year legal examination 6 weeks after the verdict. She called me from outside the examination building, her voice completely flat and controlled in the way that betrayed everything. I told her dad would have made her read the results back to him twice. She laughed, the real kind. We were 21 and 20 years old when Richard slid that paper across the kitchen table and told us we owned nothing. We were 22 and 21 when we walked back into that office as the people our father had always known we would become. We had not won because of luck. We had won because two kids who grew up watching their father build something from nothing had paid close enough attention to understand, when it mattered most, exactly how building worked. You find the load-bearing walls. You test them. You build on what holds. Everything else comes down on its own.